For decades, the Soviet Union built walls, prisons, and armies to protect its power. But the thing that frightened them the most wasn't an American missile. It was an American voice, a radio signal that crossed borders, ignored censorship, and told the truth. Tonight, you'll discover how US radio broadcasts quietly weakened the most secretive regime in history without firing a single shot. Picture a nation so afraid of words that it built walls of noise to keep them out. A nation that believed its greatest enemy was not an army, not a missile, not even a nuclear bomb, but a voice. For decades, the Soviet Union spent enormous resources trying to silence American radio broadcasts. Not because those broadcasts carried weapons, but because they carried something far more dangerous, truth. And tonight, you're going to understand why. At the end of World War II, the United States stood at a crossroads. It had emerged not only as a military power, but as a symbol of something the world had never fully seen before. A nation capable of self-criticism, public debate, and peaceful transfer of power, even after the most destructive war in human history. Across the Atlantic, the Soviet Union emerged victorious, but deeply wounded. Entire cities were gone. Farms lay empty. Families had lost fathers, mothers, sons, daughters. Stalin ruled over a traumatized population, and trauma breeds fear. Fear demands control. From the very beginning of the Cold War, the Kremlin understood one brutal truth. If Soviet citizens were ever allowed to compare their reality with the outside world, the system would collapse. So information became the most tightly guarded resource in the entire empire. Newspapers were identical from city to city. Radio stations read from scripts approved at the highest levels. Foreign journalists were monitored constantly. Even personal letters were opened, copied, and sometimes altered before delivery. Yet radio waves ignored borders. In the late 1940s, American policymakers realized something extraordinary. They understood that the Iron Curtain was not just physical, it was psychological. And the most effective way to challenge it was not through threats, but through consistency, credibility, and patience. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, millions of Soviet citizens had spent decades secretly listening to Western radio. They were no longer isolated. They knew how the world worked. When Glasnost began, the information flood could not be stopped. In 1988, jamming ended quietly. No announcement, no apology, just silence. 3 years later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. No invasion, no occupation, no final battle, just the collapse of belief. American radio did not topple the Soviet Union alone, but it did something no missile ever could. It convinced millions that truth was stronger than fear, and that may be the most powerful weapon ever created. If you want more stories about the hidden battles that shaped our world, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay tuned, because some wars are never fought on maps, only in minds. By the time the Soviet leadership realized how deeply Western radio had penetrated their society, it was already too late. The danger was no longer limited to factory workers or students secretly listening late at night. The danger had reached the heart of the system itself. Party officials, military officers, scientists, engineers, even members of the security services were listening. Inside the Kremlin, reports began to circulate that terrified senior officials. Interrogations revealed that people were quoting exact phrases from Radio Liberty broadcasts. Others referenced economic data that had never appeared in Soviet newspapers. Some even questioned official versions of history during internal meetings. This was not dissent in the streets. This was dissent in the minds. The Soviet state had been built on a monopoly of narrative. If the party defined reality, reality existed. If the party denied something, it did not exist. Western radio shattered that monopoly one broadcast at a time. To counter this, the KGB expanded its methods. Listening itself became a crime not always punishable by arrest, but by psychological pressure. Employers were instructed to have conversations. Neighbors were encouraged to report unusual behavior. Children were questioned about what their parents listened to at night. The goal was not only punishment, it was fear. But fear has limits. In the Baltic states, listening to Western radio became an act of cultural survival. Programs in Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian reminded listeners that their nations had existed before Soviet occupation and could exist again. In Ukraine, agricultural broadcasts explaining Western farming methods contradicted decades of collectivization propaganda. Farmers understood immediately that they had been lied to. In Russia itself, Radio Liberty's historical programs destroyed the myth of Stalin as an infallible leader. Names of purge victims were spoken aloud. Dates were mentioned. Locations of mass graves were discussed. Once spoken, these truths could not be erased. The Soviet response grew increasingly desperate. New jamming techniques were tested, including mobile interference units and atmospheric disruption attempts. None worked reliably. At the same time, the West refined its approach. Broadcasts were carefully timed. Frequencies changed rapidly. Linguists ensured accents sounded familiar. Journalists avoided exaggeration. Knowing credibility was everything. This patience paid off. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet citizens heard two very different versions of reality. State media spoke of imperialist aggression. Western radio explained the logic, the risks, and the negotiations. For the first time, millions understood how close the world had come to annihilation, and how secrecy nearly made it worse. Inside Soviet universities, students passed around handwritten notes summarizing foreign broadcasts. These samizdat materials spread faster than censors could stop them. By the 1970s, entire underground intellectual networks existed whose primary source of information was Western radio. The KGB understood the implications perfectly. This was not rebellion. This was preparation. Every authoritarian system survives on the assumption that it is permanent. Western radio introduced the most dangerous idea of all, that the system was temporary. That idea took root slowly, invisibly, and irreversibly. When Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan in 1979, state media framed it as international assistance. Western radio reported casualties, resistance, and internal dissent. Families with sons in uniform listened carefully. Trust collapsed further. By the time Gorbachev rose to power, censorship was already failing. Glasnost was not a gift to the people. It was an acknowledgement that control had been lost. Once archives began opening, Western radio shifted again. It no longer merely contradicted the state, contextualized it, connected past lies to present failures. This was devastating. Former party loyalists felt betrayed. Younger generations felt liberated. Older citizens felt grief for decades stolen by silence. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Western radio did not celebrate. It documented, calmly, respectfully, truthfully, that restraint mattered. In the aftermath, newly independent states cited foreign broadcasts as their first exposure to uncensored information. Journalists trained by Radio Free Europe became leaders in new media institutions. The legacy endured. The lesson of this story is not that America won the Cold War through radio. The lesson is far more powerful. America trusted truth enough to let it speak for itself. No army can occupy every mind. No wall can block every signal. No regime can silence curiosity forever. And when people are trusted with information, they eventually demand freedom. If you want to understand how invisible battles shape history more than visible wars ever could, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay with us, because the most dangerous weapon ever created doesn't explode. It speaks. For decades, the Soviet Union believed it could control not only territory, armies, and borders, but the human mind itself. The regime built walls of concrete, erected vast surveillance systems, and planted informants in every neighborhood, every university, every workplace. But there was one thing it could never fully contain, never truly silence: the idea of freedom. And that idea traveled quietly, night after night, through radio waves. While the Kremlin poured billions into jamming towers, interference systems, and censorship technology, American engineers kept transmitting. Calmly, methodically, relentlessly. This was not a war of explosions, but of endurance. Not a battle for land, but for conscience. Every broadcast from the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty was a quiet reminder that the free world still existed, that real elections were possible, that newspapers could operate without party approval, that courts did not answer to a single ideology, that governments could be questioned without fear of disappearing in the night. The greatest fear of the Soviet leadership was never a direct military invasion. It was comparison. The moment when an ordinary citizen, sitting alone in a small apartment in Moscow, Kiev, Prague, or Warsaw, realized that their reality was not inevitable, that another way of life existed. That realization was dangerous. That is why repression intensified. Being caught listening to foreign radio could cost a person their job, their freedom, sometimes their life. And yet, millions listened. Intellectuals, factory workers, soldiers, scientists, students, some out of curiosity, some out of quiet defiance, some because deep down they already knew something was wrong. The Soviet state tried to rewrite the truth. It labeled American broadcasts as imperialist propaganda, capitalist lies designed to destabilize socialism. But propaganda collapses when confronted with consistency. And the stories crossing the airwaves were slowly confirmed by everyday Soviet life itself. Shortages, censorship, fear, and systemic corruption. Meanwhile, in the United States, the strategy was never flawless, but it was steady. Contrary to Soviet caricatures, these broadcasts did not promise paradise. They promised something far more powerful: choice, dignity, a voice. The Cold War was not won by a single president, a single weapon, or a single moment. It was won through accumulated pressure, through countless small fractures in the Soviet system. Radio was one of those fractures, invisible, persistent, and impossible to eliminate completely. When protests began to rise across Eastern Europe, when dissidents spoke openly about human rights, when workers started questioning the party line, the Kremlin realized too late that total control had failed. The truth had slipped through the cracks. In the final years of the Soviet Union, something revealing occurred. Radio jamming gradually decreased, not because the regime had become tolerant, but because absolute silence had become too expensive, too complex, and politically unsustainable. The system was exhausted, bankrupt, hollowed out from within. And when it finally collapsed, it did not fall with a nuclear explosion, but with collective fatigue. The broadcasts the regime tried to silence for decades outlived the Soviet state itself. Not as weapons, but as records. Proof that free ideas, transmitted patiently and consistently, can survive any dictatorship. Today, it is easy to underestimate the power of a radio. A simple object, no glamour, no physical force, but that simplicity was its greatest strength. It required no permission, no approval, only someone willing to listen. This was an American victory that does not appear on battle maps. It has no massive monuments and no dramatic victory parades, but it was real, a moral victory, a victory of words over fear. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Regimes can silence individual voices, but they can never silence the truth once it finds a way to be heard. If you've made it this far, you've just witnessed the story of an invisible war. A war fought without gunfire, yet one that helped bring down one of the most oppressive regimes in modern history. And as long as there are people willing to listen, to question, and to think freely, that war will never be lost. If you value real history that doesn't appear in textbooks, stories buried under decades of censorship and silence, this channel is for you. Subscribe, leave a like, and stay with us here at Hidden War Secrets, where the wars that shape the world are finally exposed. We'll see you in the next chapter of the history they hoped you would never discover.